In this video, I'm going to show you how I use Unreal Engine's PCG tools to scatter meshes and blueprint actors across the landscape that I can use collision objects to trigger animations on these blueprints. This is kind of part 3 of a 3-part series, kind of. But in the first one, I walk through, here's how I made this asset in Cinema 4D, how I animate it and bring it into Unreal. The second video, I show you how to take that asset, put it inside of a blueprint, and set up collisions so you can use that to trigger animations automatically without having to keyframe stuff, which is super helpful. This is the step 3 of how you can take that one step further and start to scatter stuff more procedurally. And it just saves a bunch of time not having to manually place stuff or keyframe stuff. Super fun. So the first thing we're going to want to do, if you haven't already, we're going to go up into plugins, and you want to make sure that if we type in procedural, you want to make sure that these are checked on. So your procedural content generation framework, do those, restart if you need to. That's going to make it so we can create the PCG volumes and we can start to scatter these things. So I've already got this done, but if you want to know how to do that, you just simply right click, and if those are activated, you go down and create a PCG graph, and that's what you need to do. Now I have already gone ahead and started these, so I'm going to walk through each piece of this and show you the process. So like I said, we'll link to the other videos in here of how to make these things, but this is our asset that we're going to use along with some other mega scans to try to create the surface and go from there. The first thing you're going to want to do is make a new actor. So once again, to do that, you could do right click, blueprint class, and then create an empty actor. I've already gone ahead and done that, and I'm going to show you what I've made here. So this one's pretty simple. I called it BP Spline PCG, and all I did was create a spline. I made sure that I set this to close the loop because in this scene I want to create this spline based area that I can drag the points around and have all this stuff happen in between. I made it a circle. You can make it whatever you want, but the important thing is you have this spline and you have this PCG volume. So I went through and added this component. Now I've already gone ahead and plugged in the first one that I want to use, which is what I'm going to use for this one. But in the scene, if you go and select this PCG spline that I have, you can swap these out. So the whole point of this spline rig is that you can duplicate this around and you can make different variations depending on what you want for these volumes and kind of work. You don't have to make a whole new blueprint every time. So PCG and our spline, that's what we need. And I've already dropped that into the scene here, as you can see. I've scattered this around. This is, some of it's below, some of it's above this landscape, and I just kind of lightly deformed it to make this little bowl because that's what I wanted out of it. And the next thing, we're going to dive into the PCG volume that we created. Now this isn't going to be comprehensive by any means for this, but I'm going to walk you through the steps that I created to show you how we're going to place static meshes and our actor blueprints in here to scatter them, and then I'll show you how we can finally trigger those in Sequencer when we're all said and done. So I'm going to expand this right now just so you can see the overview. Now some things aren't unplugged, and this is just so I can show you how this works, but the first node that we're going to want to make is get spline data. Pretty straightforward. Get spline data. We're going to drop that in, and this is just going to reference the spline. So because we're using this PCG volume in the blueprint, it's going to reference the spline of that blueprint. So that's all buttoned up and ready to go. It's all going to reference. After that, the next thing you want to focus in on is spline sampler. So with this, there's a couple things that you need to adjust first. This is basically going to say, here's our spline. We're going to, clone a bunch of instances onto this, and we're going to show you how to do it. So by default, this comes on with on spline. So if you want all of these to actually be on the spline, which could have some really nice uses, you can do that, but I set this to on interior, because anything inside of this circle I want to be generating the splines, or generating all of the meshes. So next I added a curve to this, and I'm going to start to show you what we're getting out of this. But if you want to see how to do this, it's like a timeline node. You just pretty much right click, add a key in here, and then I've got the first one at time 0 set to 1, and the second one at time 1 set to 0, and this is just going to create fall off on here. So I'm going to collapse this down. I'm going to select this node. You could come down here to debug and tick this on, but I'm just going to hit D, which is the hotkey for it. Make a little bit of room over here. So you can see now that this, if I went through and adjusted this, you could start to control the fall off and the intensity of this. But since I want this to be at back here at 1, so 0, 1, set that back. That's going to give me white in the center and black on the outside, and it's just assigning values to these that we can use to filter out as we go. And that's it for that node. So next, I'm going to walk through this filter section that I have. And I have 2 of these. I'll show you in a bit why they're different, but it basically just duplicated this first line down to here and just changed a couple things. So this density filter is the first thing you're going to want to make. And at this rate, this is going to filter out the points that are from white down to black. And I've got the low bound set to 0 and the top one set to 1. I could go through and alter this and filter this out. Oops, get rid of that first. We're going to debug this guy. So show that once again. So we set our debug onto here. But if I set this at 0.5, now it's just going to spawn instances on these cubes at the range that I set. This first one I'm using static meshes, and it's going to be used for grass, so I'm just having this go all the way out to the edge, and we'll filter others as we go. The next node you're going to want to make is density noise, and as you can see here, this is going to apply a noise value to all of the points that are still in here. And this is good to get random patterns, and we can start to, you can adjust the noise min and the noise max, so if you're really wanting to filter this out, you can, but since I'm using 0 to 1, I didn't change anything, I just left it. And you also have your seed, which when we get to copy and pasting later, it's important to have this so this noise pattern aligns as we go. And if you want to check other things too as well, like you can see how this starts to affect things. So if I go to 0.5, you can see we can start carving away at this volume if we just want to clone within this area. So let's turn off, oops, let's turn off our filter there, and we'll go back into the next density filter. This is where it starts to get a bit more important. You can start to see these gaps that I have in here because I've set this to 0.1. I can crank this up and start really thinning out where I want these instances to spawn, but because I want this to be predominantly grass with the static meshes, 0.1 is what I used, and the upper bound was set to 1. So filter that out. Okay, so back to this. The next thing after that, so we've got all of our points, but we want to stick these to the landscape. It's pretty simple and pretty fast. You're going to make this projection node and plug it in. And then when you started this graph, you have an input and an output. Not using the output for this, but I did bring the input over. You twirl this arrow down, and you can see I have this landscape. I'm using the landscape to plug this into the projection and to simulate what this is doing. Now you can see that it's locking all of these instances down to the surface, which is great. We can go back and filter these out and keep adjusting, but now these are glued to the landscape. And I know there's ways that you can like force the normals if you want things to be up, but I was happy with how this worked, so I moved on from there. And the next one, and the last point in this change that I used, was this transform. So you can see it's a bit chaotic, but what I'm doing is, if you use cloners at all, it's kind of like an effector, but you can set the minimum and maximum offset for these. So if I reset it, you can see there's a little bit of movement. And the big one would be this rotation that I'm adding. So if I set this to 0, you can see they're all facing the same way. I set it to 720 because I wanted these just to have some random rotation. Same thing goes with the scale, min and max. You can knock this down. You can make things even smaller. And tweak these and you get this variety, but for this sake I wanted these to be a bit larger and fill in and have some overlap. And the last node for this is static mesh spawner. So if I plug this in, turn off debug, and I plug this in, and we're going to exit out of that. Now you can see we've got grass wherever I put this spline, which is great. So if I want to adjust this, I can take it out, and you can just see the grass goes on the surface. It's great. And to get the grass in here, which is probably the last thing that's really important, you'll see under settings over here we have mesh entries. Now I've already added 3 of these array elements, but you can hit plus and drop them in. Twirl it down, and under descriptor I picked the mega scan that I wanted, and I just dropped these static meshes in. So I've got 3 different versions from the same grass just to give it some variety. And that's the setup for the grass. So I'm going to back up here for a minute. We're pretty much going to use this same part and go through it with a couple exceptions. So the next thing that we want to do is to start getting into how do we get our actors in here. So we went through the static meshes. Now we want to get the actors that we can animate. Same thing I'm going to go through. We've got the density filter. So at this time, I've adjusted the lower bound because I only want these to spawn in the middle. I don't want them all up to the edge. And as you'll see in a minute, this can be a bit taxing. The static meshes and using nanite, it's made for this. You can do an insane amount, but because we're using collision and these are more like individually referenced, I try to use them a bit sparingly because if you cake them everywhere, you will notice a performance hit. So onto the density noise, you can see using the exact same noise pattern, this aligns perfectly with this. So that way where we have gone through and created those voids, now I've took the exact same node up here and I just clicked invert filter. And I'm not going to get into it in this one, but you could set variables and you can override the upper and lower bounds for these. So if you make a change to this one, it's automatically going to adjust to this one. But because this is pretty simple, I didn't bother with it. It wasn't a lot of manual work at that point. Yet again, I've got the projection, so now these are now locked down to the surface. I went through and applied a similar transform. I tweaked some of the stuff a little bit just to get some variation in the results, especially with the scale. I wanted some to be a little shorter and taller. And then we're getting back to the density filters. Now, one thing to notice on this, I've got this spawn actor node that we'll get to in a second. But unlike the static mesh spawner where you have this array where you can just make as many of these as you want, the spawn actor only appears to give you one option. So the workaround to that is I just created, I have 3 of the same blueprint that I duplicated and just swapped materials. So Bloom A, Bloom B, and Bloom C. These are my 3 actors that I'm using, and I just did a unique one for each spawn actor. And on these density filters, I went and created the upper and lower bounds. Now this took me a minute because I was trying to go from 0 to 1 like the other one, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. But the problem is there was the threshold capped out at like 0.12, which I think is because of the density filter that I have here. So I think, yeah, 0.12 on the lower bounds. These density filters need to all stay within that because if I go over it, it just doesn't matter, and I couldn't figure out why only one of these was working and the other ones weren't. And lastly, you just plug these in. So I've got 1, 2, and 3. And now you can see what I'm saying here is all of these assets start to spawn out as they're individual. So this can start to get a bit heavy if you go crazy with it. But for this setup, minimize all of this down, I've got all of these within this bowl. I can expand this spline out that I want to, and I can go through and tweak it. And it's spawning all 3 actors in here, which is great. So I've got this scene set up. I just did a quick camera move, and I've got this trigger box, which should show you that. And this was covered in a different video. You can see how it works, but if I scrub through, you can see this collider is going to run through all these, and it's going to trigger that bloom animation when it hits every single one, which is great. And finally, to test this out, I'm going to run play. We're going to let this go and just see. And just like that, I've got 3 different colors. You can populate pretty much whatever you want into these blueprints and trigger it this way, and take these splines, stack a bunch of these around. I mean, you could have a camera fly through here with a collider on it that's just hitting stuff as you fly through a scene, and it triggers it. So there's loads of possibilities with this workflow. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to using this a lot more. Thanks for watching. Hope you found this helpful. If you did, like, subscribe, do all the YouTube good stuff so you can see more videos and stuff coming out. But more importantly, if you have questions about how this stuff could work, or you just like to know a bit more, or tell me how you can actually use this stuff, please leave comments below. It helps us get more feedback and it helps our channel. Thanks.